might be kind of interesting to talk a little bit about bioluminescence to start. And so you may have heard of bioluminescence before, or maybe you've seen some of these creatures before. They are basically living organisms that kind of give off light. About 90% of them are aquatic, though, meaning that they're ocean animals. And basically, they take light energy and release it as chemical energy. And so they have photoreceptors within their cells. And the light that you're seeing is kind of basically pigments. And so why I think it's kind of interesting to talk about with photosynthesis is you'll learn that they're doing it for different reasons. But a lot of the same kind of technique is occurring. So you've heard me say photoreceptors. That's something we're going to see with photosynthesis in our plants. You're going to hear me say light energy later on as well, and then transferring that light energy into chemical energy. So remember, when we're transferring energies, we're not, energy is not destroyed and it's not created, it's just transferred. And again, we might lose a little bit of that energy when it transfers, but it's just a different phenomena. So again, we're taking light energy and we're changing it into releasing as chemical energy to kind of emit pigments. And so pigments, again, is something we're going to see when we talk about photosynthesis this week. So why do these organisms do this? Well, they're trying to attract prey, possibly. Or are they scaring predators, or are they communicating? So think about that. You know, one phenomenon that's really interesting back in the early 1900s, when they had coal mines, they didn't want to bring, they didn't have electricity yet to kind of go through those coal mines for lights. And they didn't want to bring candles, obviously, down there for the chance that they might actually start a fire. So what they actually did was gather fireflies and put them in jars. Obviously, they needed a lot of fireflies inside the jars in order to light and illuminate their way down there. So think about that. That had to be a lot of little bugs in each jar to kind of illuminate things. But that was the way they kind of got away with doing that, using them as a light source. In a lot of respects, though, you see these in the ocean at night. So if you've never been near the ocean, particularly at night, you may never have really seen bioluminescent organisms in person. But if you haven't, I would try to make the opportunity to even do that in some type of aquarium setting. So photosynthesis is where we're headed for this week. So let's talk about photosynthesis and what that actually means and some of those terms I just talked about. So in the most simplest ways, we can say that photosynthesis basically converts light energy, usually solar energy, to create a chemical energy within the plant. That is the most simplest way to say this. However, photosynthesis is a very complex process within our plants and even some aquatic type of plants. So if we kind of look at this here, here are just some bigger plants. We have some multicellular algae, so alga. These are very beautiful. We have some unicellular protist, cyanobacteria, which a lot of times comes in our area in ponds and lakes in the area, where basically in the summer the temperature is really hot and it becomes really stagnant and the water is not moving. We get that often, and sometimes that closes down places where we like to swim in the summer. So when we talk about photosynthesis, we're talking about this happening in all these different types of organisms. So this is what we call an oxidation-reduction reaction. So when we're creating that light energy into chemical energy, we have what we call an oxidation and then a reduction reaction. And what that really is talking about was when electrons actually are transferring their electrons. I said that wrong. Let me say that again. So when atoms or molecules are basically transferring their electrons, we know they like to do that. They like to swap and share. So it's kind of like what we think of as an ionic bond. But basically, if an atom or molecule is giving an electron, so they want to give their electron to something else, another atom or molecule, that's called oxidized or oxidation. So that's the oxidation piece of it. The opposite of that is if you are an atom or a molecule that is receiving an electron, that's actually called reduction. And that's kind of like doesn't make sense in our head, right? If I'm receiving an electron, why would that be reducing? Like that word reduction usually means losing something or getting rid of something or making it smaller, right? So that's the tricky part of this. Remember, maybe R, receive, R, reduce. Maybe that will help you. So when you receive an electron, an atom or molecule receives a receives an electron, it's called reduction or reduced, okay? Now, one thing that's so big that you need to remember when we're thinking about this process, so the kind of giving and then receiving of our electrons. Remember, electrons have a negative charge, so that's going to change the charge of things, so the polarity is going to be different. But the one thing you need to remember is electrons always follow the path of hydrogen atoms. So remember, hydrogen atoms are just this usually by themselves, okay? Now if we go back to our periodic table, how many electrons and how many protons do we talk about? Well, if we look at our table here, we know we have one proton, and therefore we must have one electron because they are balanced. Remember, we want a balanced charge. So what you need to remember in this oxidation-reduction reaction is wherever this wonderful hydrogen goes, electron is following it. So when we have the transfer of hydrogen atoms, electrons are flowing in the same exact pathway as them. Oops. Okay, so what's important here is these are our reactants. So again, general, this is very, very general. So these are what we, in our chemical equation, what we call reactants. These are the things that are going to react together. So right here, we have carbon dioxide. Okay, so this is carbon dioxide. Sorry, I'm writing really quickly here. And then obviously this is what we consider water, H2O. So CO2 plus H2O is the basics as far as what we're talking about our reactants in this process. So what's happening in a reduction reaction is that basically what's happening, and I'm just going to kind of go forward here, is that the hydrogen, okay, is going to leave our water. So it's going to break off. It's going to hydrolyze, break off. So what's going to happen is that hydrogen is actually going to get transferred over here to that carbon dioxide. And when it does that, obviously, electron moves as well. So again, if we are losing an electron, this is oxidation. And when we get over here, this arrow always represents the kind of way in which the reaction is moving. In this example, it's moving this way. These are our products, okay? So here are our products. And what are our products? Well, what did you notice is happening here? So what actually happens is not just one hydrogen ion leaves and one electron. Because we have two hydrogens there, they both leave and they both move over here to our carbon dioxide. So when we get to our products, you'll see that now this guy was kind of hanging out here. He's still over here. There's a reason why there are two of them because we haven't looked at the full equation at this point. But what we've now created is we had, this is the original carbon and the original oxygen from our carbon dioxide. But now those hydrogen atoms are over here as well. And so when we do this C6H12O6, we created a whole new molecule, which we call glucose. Glucose is the simplest sugar, remember. Our body will use this often to gather. It's basically going to be used as a fuel, right? So maybe a fuel, thinking of food. Now, here is again explaining the H2O is oxidized. It loses the reaction. It loses the electron, excuse me. So the H leaving brings an electron. The second H leaves, brings an electron. That's oxidation. Now, this wonderful CO2 is the receiver of those wonderful electrons, and so it gained electrons. So remember, receiver means reduction, RR. So the CO2 is then reduced because it's gaining the electrons. And we see that gain over here when we created the whole new molecule of glucose. So kind of a general outline for Chapter 5. We're going to spend 2 weeks on Chapter 5. We're going to talk about flowering plants and photosynthetic pigments in week 1. And then in week 2, we're going to actually talk more about photosynthesis and what's happening in the reactions. So light reaction versus dark reactions, how it's cyclical and non-cyclical, then this idea of carbon fixation with the Calvin cycle. So we'll spend more time on the bottom half of this next week. So let's just talk a little bit about photosynthetic plants, and then we'll probably end up with another video on the pigments. So photosynthetic plants, so basically all life on Earth, whether it's plants, whether it's bacteria, whether it's human type of organisms, so plants or animals, we all depend on a star that is 93 million miles away. And that star is actually the sun. So life depends on that sun to be up in the sky and shining at us. So basically, the sun, so that star, provides the photosynthetic organisms with that light energy that we specifically call solar energy. And that is so very important. And now, so these photosynthetic organisms, they're going to go through this process called photosynthesis. And it's a process in which basically it's going to capture the solar energy from the sun. And that is really like a light energy, remember. It's going to transform, the solar energy at a molecular level to chemical energy. And when that chemical energy comes out, the energy is usually stored as a carbohydrate, example, glucose, for the plants to use as their food source, the fuel in their body. Not necessarily energy, but the energy stored in a carbohydrate for them. So again, it's really important that you realize that that's what is actually happening here. So just a little bit more about these organisms. Photosynthesizers produce all food energy. So let's think about that for a minute. Only 42% of the sun's energy directed towards the earth actually reaches the surface. Okay, so only 42% of that solar energy that comes down through earth actually reaches our surface. So reaches, the pavement where we walk, the fields that we, near our house, the lawn in our yard. And only 2% of that, so of the 42%, only 2% of that is captured by the photosynthesizers. And so of this, only a tiny little portion results in what we consider biomass. Now, when we talk about these wonderful photosynthesizing organisms, these are what we call photoautotrophs. Now, you remember I've talked about autotrophs before. Autotrophs can make their own food. Photoautotrophs are basically specifically categorizing them as they capture that light energy from the sun and then convert it to build food molecules for themselves. So if we kind of look at photosynthesizing kind of in plants, we know most plants have a lot of green portions. And inside that green portion, which again, not all plants are green, some are red, some are kind of orangey in color. There's this what we call mesophyll tissue, and the mesophyll contain those chloroplasts. So we've already learned about chloroplast as one of these organelles that are within each of our plant cells, but that is the cell that's important. This is the tissue, so the mesophyll is the tissue. So what basically happens, oh, my picture's kind of off here, so I apologize, is that the CO2 enters the leaves through the stomata, and then it's going to react and diffuse to the chloroplast. So the chloroplast is colored green because what's inside there is our pigments. So here's just an example. Here's our bigger leaf. If we take a small portion of that leaf and we kind of blow it up so we can see what it looks like. Here's our chloroplast. You can see them, okay, and inside they have stacks. Here's the stomata, and that's the surface of the plant where things are moving into and out of. So this is where gas exchange is happening. So think about that. It's kind of like protein channels on the surface, but they're a little different. They're called the stomata. They're tiny little channels that allow gases to move in and out because this is a really gas-based type of process. So here's our chloroplast kind of all nicely built up for us to see, and inside of it you can see the stacks of the grana, and this is again a mesocell. Here's another view, a little bit different view for you to look at of the chloroplast. And we'll end right here.